A wealthy widower and businessman took his housekeeper to a business dinner, but what she did when she got there left everyone shocked. Emma had been working at Daniel Carrington's mansion for nearly 3 years. She was dedicated to her job, but she never imagined he would call her in for such a strange and unexpected conversation. Daniel, a famous and cold businessman, was going through a crisis in his company and needed to impress powerful investors at a business dinner that night. Without time or patience to find a suitable companion, he looked at Emma, who was polishing the shelves in his office, and said arrogantly, "I need you to accompany me to an important dinner tonight. This is not an invitation. It's an instruction. Go and behave. I need someone discreet and without an opinion of their own." Emma was surprised but didn't show it. The request felt more like an order, however, she knew this was her chance to prove something more as she accepted. She already felt the growing tension and the opportunity awaiting her. This would not be an ordinary night. Emma arrived at the restaurant on time, wearing a beautiful, elegant dress. Daniel was waiting at the entrance, visibly impatient. He barely looked at her, just giving a curt, "Let's go," as if he were taking an unnecessary accessory rather than a person. Entering the sophisticated restaurant, Emma felt all eyes turned toward them. The group of investors was waiting at a table in the center of the room. Daniel introduced Emma vaguely and disinterestedly, without even mentioning her last name. "This is Emma, she's accompanying me tonight," he said quickly, looking away. The investors, men in suits with evaluating gazes, responded with polite smiles, although some exchanged looks of bewilderment. To them, Emma did not seem to belong there, and it was evident in their silent looks of judgment. Emma noticed every detail but maintained her composure. During the dinner, Daniel and the investors discussed numbers, profits, and expansion plans. Emma remained silent, attentively observing and, in a way, absorbing every detail. At one point, one of the investors, Mr. Scott, a tall man with an imposing posture, turned to her with a condescending smile. "So, Emma, how do you feel about attending a business dinner like this?" he asked, his tone clearly expecting a timid response. Emma felt the tension around the table. She could simply smile and respond with something insignificant, but instead, she decided to assert herself. "Actually, it's fascinating to see how everything works up close," she said calmly. "Seeing the concern with financial details and projections is interesting, but I believe understanding the people behind the numbers is also essential." The looks around the table froze. Emma maintained her serene demeanor, while Daniel watched her with a mix of surprise and irritation. She had just shown that she had a voice of her own, something he had ordered her to avoid. Mr. Scott, surprised by her response, let out a short laugh but seemed intrigued. "An interesting perspective," he replied, while the other investors looked at her with newfound curiosity. Daniel's expression hardened, visibly uncomfortable with the attention Emma was starting to attract. The night was becoming anything but discreet, exactly the opposite of what he had planned. However, Emma seemed to be finally finding her own voice in an environment that, until then, didn't seem to belong to her. As the dinner continued, Emma remained firm, even sensing Daniel's discomfort. He avoided any eye contact with her, clearly annoyed by her attitude. Mr. Scott, however, seemed increasingly interested in involving Emma in the conversation, perhaps because she was the only one there defying the stereotype he expected at a business dinner. When the topic shifted to social responsibility, something that seemed to distance Daniel even further from the investors' interests, Emma seized the opportunity to contribute. "Does Mr. Carrington already consider social projects in his company?" Mr. Scott asked, casting a provocative look at Daniel. Daniel hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. Before he could give a vague response, Emma, without losing her composure, responded directly, "I believe social initiatives are a way to give back to the community for the success the company has achieved. After all, companies exist for more than just profit. It would be an important step." Silence fell over the table, and Emma felt every eye on her. But instead of retreating, she maintained a serene expression. For her, this was a matter of integrity. Mr. Scott, visibly impressed, smiled. "Exactly what I think, Emma. It's rare to hear that around here," he said, clearly provoking Daniel. Daniel's expression turned rigid. He had brought Emma to the dinner to be invisible, and now she was attracting unwanted attention. Annoyed, he decided to do something that would change the course of the evening. "Well, it's easy to talk when you don't know the weight of leadership decisions, Emma," he said with a slight smirk. "Don't you think you're speaking about something you don't understand?" Emma's eyes met Daniel's, and she sensed the challenge in his words. But instead of shrinking back, she responded firmly. "Maybe I don't know the weight of leadership decisions, but I understand their impact, and sometimes those further from power see things that those at the top can't." Her response was direct and unexpected. Mr. Scott, surprised, let out a laugh, clearly impressed with Emma's courage. The other investors exchanged approving looks. Emma's demeanor impressed everyone, and in just a few minutes, she had changed the dynamics of the dinner. Daniel fell silent, feeling he had lost control of the situation. He tried to mask his discomfort, but the damage was already done. To him, this was an unforgivable affront. When the dinner finally ended, he didn't wait for Emma to leave by his side. Instead, he went ahead, leaving her behind. Emma, however, didn't need his company. She knew she had stood her ground, that her voice had been heard, and that was what mattered most to her. But little did she know, Daniel wouldn't let that night go unaddressed. Back at the mansion, Daniel couldn't contain his irritation. As soon as Emma walked through the door, he called her into his office, dispensing with any formality. His eyes were full of frustration and disdain. "What were you thinking, Emma?" he fired at her, barely waiting for her to sit down. "I asked you to accompany me to be discreet, not to become the center of attention." Emma, still calm after the intense night, maintained her composure. She knew this conversation wouldn't end well, but she didn't regret her actions. "I just answered a question, Mr. Carrington. I did nothing but express my opinion," she said in a controlled tone. "Opinion?" He looked at her with disdain. "You're a housekeeper, Emma. You're not paid to have an opinion. At a business dinner, you went too far, overstepped every boundary." She held her breath, feeling the injustice of his words. Daniel didn't understand her motivation, her desire to show she could go beyond the work she did. To him, she could never be more than the housekeeper. "If my presence was so bothersome, why did you take me there?" Emma asked, her voice calm but firm. "Don't give me that. You were doing your job, and getting paid, including to stay silent." Daniel responded, his voice cold and calculated. "Consider this your last day here. You're fired." The declaration felt like a final sentence, but Emma, determined, didn't let the impact show. She just nodded, maintaining her dignity. She stood up, and with one last look at Daniel, turned her back and left the mansion, knowing she would never have to endure Daniel's disdain again. That night had given her a clear vision of who she was and what she could do. Emma knew that this firing, although harsh, was just the beginning of a new chapter. The next day, as she was packing her last things, she received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Scott, the investor who had been impressed with her stance at the dinner. He wanted her on his team, a position she had never imagined being offered to her. With a mix of surprise and determination, Emma accepted the offer. The humiliation of Daniel's firing quickly transformed into the opportunity of a lifetime. In the months that followed, Emma shone in her new position under Mr. Scott's guidance. She discovered talents and abilities she had never had the chance to explore while working for Daniel. Her determination and leadership skills quickly caught the attention of her colleagues, and she became a respected figure within the company. Finally, Emma was in an environment where her voice was heard and valued. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation couldn't have been worse. The crisis in his company was worsening. Impulsive decisions focused solely on immediate profit were taking their toll, and due to his arrogance, Daniel had lost important contracts and driven away valuable business partners. The tide turned completely when the company where Emma now worked acquired a significant portion of Daniel's company's shares, putting Emma in a leadership position directly linked to his business. The reunion happened at a major leaders' meeting. When Daniel entered the room and saw Emma sitting at the conference table, his face paled. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on her as if trying to understand how his former housekeeper could be there among the leaders. Emma met his gaze, relentless but serene, without any apparent trace of resentment. For her, what mattered was her new position and the opportunity to make a difference. The tension was just beginning. After the meeting, Daniel approached her, his expression rigid, filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Emma," he muttered, trying to keep control. "So now you're here with them?" Emma stood firm, not letting his surprise affect her demeanor. "Yes, Daniel," she replied, her voice calm but confident. "I'm here because I earned my place, something you could never understand, considering how quickly you discarded people who could have helped you." Daniel stood there, struggling to mask his confusion and anger. He had never imagined that the woman he had treated as nothing more than an accessory, a housekeeper beneath his notice, could be in a position where she could look him in the eye as an equal. He had always considered himself superior to everyone, particularly those beneath him, but Emma had completely shattered that illusion. "I didn't expect to see you here," he muttered, trying to regain some composure, but his words were strained. Emma didn't flinch. "I'm sure you didn't. But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't expect much from anyone, including yourself. You could have seen potential in people, had you bothered to look. But you always preferred the easy route, the shortcut. Thinking money and power could solve everything." Daniel's jaw clenched, but Emma continued undeterred. "The funny thing is, your arrogance led to your downfall, and I'm now in a position where I can help shape the future of your company. It's ironic, don't you think?" For a moment Daniel was speechless, struggling to process how the tables had turned so dramatically. He had always been the one making decisions, dictating outcomes. But now, in front of him, was the woman he had dismissed so carelessly, standing at the helm of a significant force within the industry. Finally, Daniel found his voice, though it was thick with bitterness. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "You think this is justice?" Emma met his gaze evenly, her expression unshaken. "No, Daniel. I think this is growth. For both of us." She took a step closer, her tone softening, but not losing its strength. "I never wanted revenge, and I didn't need to prove anything to you. But now, I have the chance to do something good, something meaningful. I can use my position to make real change, not just for profit or power, but for people. And that's something you'll never understand, no matter how many zeros you add to your bank account." Her words hung in the air, and Daniel's face shifted, a mixture of guilt and resentment flickering in his eyes. Emma didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving him to confront the reality of the consequences of his own arrogance. As the weeks passed, Emma's influence continued to grow within the company. Her contributions were instrumental in creating new initiatives that not only focused on profit but also on community development and ethical business practices. Her approach was transformative, and it quickly earned her the respect of her colleagues. Meanwhile, Daniel's company continued to spiral. The mistakes he had made, dismissing key partnerships and alienating talented individuals, began to take a serious toll. His arrogance had driven away the people who could have helped him turn things around. The acquisition by Emma's company proved to be the final blow, and Daniel found himself struggling to maintain control. Despite his best efforts to salvage what was left, it was clear that Emma's success and leadership had become a turning point for both their lives, though it was for vastly different reasons. Emma's rise to power wasn't just about the job or the company, it was a reflection of her resilience, intelligence, and vision. And it was a stark reminder to Daniel of what he had lost when he chose to underestimate her. Months later, as Emma sat in a meeting with other industry leaders, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Scott, the investor who had given her the opportunity to turn her life around. He was offering her a new role, an even more prestigious position with the potential to change the entire industry. Emma smiled to herself as she read the message, knowing that her journey had only just begun. She had taken what was meant to be a humiliating night, a forced dinner with a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool, and turned it into the catalyst for a new chapter of her life. And as for Daniel? Well, Emma had long since moved past him. She didn't need to prove anything further. Her success spoke for itself, and in the end, it would be the very thing that defined her, not the dismissal of her worth, but the realization that she was always more than what anyone had thought. In the distance, the sound of her growing success echoed, and she knew that, no matter what Daniel thought, the story of Emma had only just begun.